Blue or red? Status quo or revolution? Will you take the blue pill and remain static, complacent, ignorant? Or will you wake up? Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake, 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 wake up. Everyone knows The Matrix. It's a great film, and among other things, an allegory for accepting one's gender identity. It's also about finding a revolutionary community to fight capitalist hegemony, but the gender thing's there. That shouldn't be controversial. It's confirmed by the directors that it was at least a part of the story. And yet, people still insist on using the language of the film to support their reactionary ideologies. Take the red pill and wake up, man. But don't wake up too much or you'll get woke, I guess? Whatever. This is old news. If you want to watch a detailed breakdown of the trans theming in The Matrix, just watch Aronof's video here. If The Matrix may or may not be an allegory for the transgender experience, what other movies can we infect with our transgender symbology? What other works of art can I pry from big, manly, cis hands and reappropriate to suit my woke agenda? Anyone can interpret anything as just about anything. That is to say, thematic readings of texts, I'm including films in texts here, are as infinite as they are subjective. However, I fall somewhere between the death of the author and the authorial intent camps, so I feel the need to acknowledge here that there's no evidence to suggest that some of the films I'll talk about were at all intended as trans allegory. Rodney Copperbottom from Robots is a trans guy. Changed my mind. So that's what I will do here. Not without evidence, of course. To those contrary Marys who say stuff like, it's not that deep, or why does everything have to be political, as if existing while trans is political, or those who would tell me that I'm reaching, here is my response to you. But what if it is that deep? Why can't it be? Finding solace or even simple commonality in the stories that mean something to you is an important part of being human. I am worried that, especially with actual literacy rates in the US plummeting right now, media literacy will become a lost art. When we cease to meaningfully engage with what we watch, are we any different than a cocoa melon rotted toddler whose brain is slowly shutting down all frontal lobe activity? Hashtag food for thought. Let's get into the meat of things. What even is transgender allegory in film? Well, first we have to define literal transgender representations in film. So, here's a brief history of trans film. Trans themes and characters are rarer to find in film than I initially anticipated when I set out on this research quest. You kind of have to dig for things. I feel this makes sense given how small the trans population is and the oppression and repression which it faces. It's not something everyone can just openly talk about all the time, especially in the past. This is where allegory comes in. But when you look, you can find portrayals of gender transgressive behavior from the very advent of film. You can see the Digital Transgender Archive for some early clips. In referring to trans film history, I'm not trying to anachronistically map a modern identity onto the past. Rather, I'm trying to use trans in an expansive way that includes a whole host of identities and behaviors. It's disingenuous, in my opinion, to split hairs too much, to try to disentangle homosexual from transgender, from queer themes, especially in early cinema, wherein, according to Vito Russo, the gay film scholar that James Somerton stole his entire steez from, quote, homosexuality emerged on screen as an unseen danger, a reflection of our fears about the perils of tampering with male and female roles. Historian Laura Horak has been foundational to my research here. They've done a great deal of the scholarly work available on this topic. And to me, Horak is building on the work of Vito Russo, author of The Celluloid Closet. According to both Russo and Horak, in the early 1900s, transgender phenomena in film were a translation of their stage iteration, a form of entertainment similar to minstrelsy, honestly. Russo writes in his first chapter about the prominence of transvestism in silent comedy, commenting on the obviously sexist origin of the sissy archetype. Feminine equals bad. He discusses the numerous cross-sex depictions in early cinema wherein he asserts, quote, "The joke lies in the very appearance of a man dressed up as a woman." In addition to numerous films of vaudevillian female impersonators and other comedic gender bending, there's this unfortunately lost now documentary about an intersex person based on their own memoirs. I believe their name is Carl Bayer, from 1919. These are the depictions that interest me more, the ones that I consider part of the lineage of queer and trans cinema. Films which contain more sincere and genuine depictions of sexual or gender variance. But in addition to this documentary, there are certain fictional depictions, according to Russo, that had more subtlety and grace than others, like those of, surprisingly, Charlie Chaplin, when he's in drag for A Woman from 1915, or Edith Story's gender-bending portrayal of Lillian/Lawrence in A Florida Enchantment from 1914. That movie is really interesting, by the way. It shows a disillusioned heiress who, upset with her unfaithful fiancé, ingests a sex-changing seed. Wish it was that easy, am I right, ladies? And becomes an alternate persona, the debonair Lawrence Talbot. There's a lot of obvious queer content in that film, as it explores different relationships between people who transgress boundaries of sex, and it's a witty commentary on sexism. Okay, editing Sam here. So, when looking for B-roll from this movie, I saw the prominence of blackface in it. So I was like, I should definitely comment on this. This film is talked about a lot in queer film history, but rarely is the racial aspect given the attention it deserves, which is why I didn't even know the film had blackface in it until searching for clips, honestly. But I don't want to sweep it under the rug, so here are just a few thoughts about that. My main source is Siobhan Somerville's chapter in Queering the Color Line. Siobhan Somerville asserts that, quote, "Within the historical context of the emergence of lesbian and gay identities and an increasingly racially segregated culture, A Florida Enchantment reflected deep cultural anxieties about the slippage of bodies out of their conventional systems of visual representation, both on the screen and off." Essentially, Somerville spends this chapter in Queering the Color Line detailing the complex relationships of gender, race, and sexuality on screen in A Florida Enchantment. The choice to cast the character Jane/Jack, who is the maid/valet later when she transforms into a man, of Lillian/Lawrence. A lot of slashes here. But the choice to cast that character as a white actress, that was common in the sense that black characters were always played by white actors at this time to maintain segregation on the film set. However, the less common thing about that was that Jane/Jack is played by an actress rather than a male actor. So white men have more of a history of performing in both drag and like minstrel blackface simultaneously, but white women performers didn't really do that. Maybe something about like the sacredness of white femininity here. This casting choice reflects the film's attempt at a more naturalistic and less minstrel-esque performance, apparently, and they seem to have wanted to draw less attention to racial aspects of the film, which is also why they changed the origin of the sex-changing seed that they swallow to be a gift, quote, freely given from Africa, instead of taken from a slave as it is in the book. In so doing, the filmmakers were potentially attempting to avoid the audience making similar realizations about the permeable social boundaries of race in the way that they would be playing with the idea of gender. Though Siobhan Somerville does say that just by having blackface and drag in close proximity in this production like that, there might also be some kind of unintentional transgressive interpretations. So while the movie is subversive in some ways, in terms of gender and sexuality, it also reinforced racialized interpretations of these concepts by allowing Lawrence to be a desirable gentleman to his white woman lover, while Jack was portrayed as a sexually aggressive black man after her transformation, whose advances to his love interest were unwanted. All in all, to again quote Somerville, quote, "For moviegoers in 1914, the enchantment of this film lay in its ability to help audiences forget that the visible upheavals in cultural meanings of gender and sexuality coincided with a racial narrative, whether it was the history of slavery or its reprise in imperialism, racial violence, and segregation." We also have a verifiable film star who we would today likely call transgender. This person starred in D.W. Griffith films, a youth called Billy Foster, who wished to be referred to as their male stage persona offstage as well. Sounds pretty trans. There's just a lot of gaps in the history, which have been really hard for me to fill in. At the risk of telling you too much you may already know, the period of time from 1934 to about 1968, wherein the so-called Hays Code imposed strict censorship over sexuality in Hollywood, well, it's pretty much a dead zone. It isn't until the 60s and 70s where you see gender and sexuality explode onto the screen. And even so, much of the trans representation is buried in the underground and indie scenes. It's not all too niche to recover. Some indie filmmakers who included trans actors and characters, like John Waters,
"I'm a man, Muffy! A man trapped in a woman's body!"
and Andy Warhol,
"What's attractive?" "Oh, I see. Politically involved girls."
did reach a level of notoriety and are valued, especially in cult followings, to this day. With films like Paul Morrissey's Women in Revolt, 1971, produced by Andy Warhol, John Waters' Pink Flamingos, 1972,
Kill everyone now! Condone first-degree murder! Advocate cannibalism! Eat shit! Filth are my politics! Filth is my life! Take whatever you like!
Yes.
and Female Trouble, 1974, and Jim Sharman's iconic Rocky Horror Picture Show, released in 1975, campy, outrageous films featuring gender non-conforming characters became more common. The 70s certainly opened up the floodgates for queer and trans characters. Whether or not this was always what we would consider good representation. For instance, Myra Breckinridge, 1970, follows a sadistic trans woman played by cis actress Raquel Welch through a romp of crime and deceit. Also released in 1970, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is a weird-ass exploitation film that was initially created to be a sequel to the earlier rock-centered drama film Valley of the Dolls. Instead, it ended up being a, quote, satirical pastiche of the original. Wikipedia says that. It's the first film I know of to represent a female-to-male transsexual, and boy is it a doozy. The trans man in it is a predatory, murderous music producer nicknamed Z-Man. At the end, he's revealed to be a trans man, or I guess a woman in drag, according to Wikipedia, when he reveals his oh-so-scary breasts. Apparently this film was low-key written as they went, and this plot twist was a last-minute decision. I don't know, maybe some practical effects artists just really wanted to practice their prosthetic work, and they just adapted it from there. The largest quantity of trans representation comes from exploitation films and from the horror genre. Obviously, some of the most iconic representations of trans-adjacent characters are in horror. We got Psycho, Dressed to Kill, Sleepaway Camp, and Silence of the Lambs. These are the ones that are discussed most frequently, especially in film and media studies circles, at least. But if you want some more trans film history that covers way more than just these films, check out this guy Logan Ashley's video, Transgender Horror: A Visual History. It is just fantastic. Then, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the number of trans characters steadily increased. There's even a few genuinely critically acclaimed films with trans protagonists. For instance, the famous Boys Don't Cry, 1999, for which Hilary Swank won an Oscar for her portrayal of real-life murdered trans man Brandon Teena. It isn't until the late 2010s, especially I feel like with the release of The Danish Girl in 2015, where people begin to have conversations about whether cis actors should really be playing trans characters all the time in the first place. But I digress, and when I digress hard. Sam, at Emo Danny DeVito, you may ask, isn't this supposed to be about trans allegory in film? And I say to you, yes, I'm getting to that, you needy little f***. This is my video, and I'll talk about what I want. I wanted to explain to you how sparse and ambivalent the actual representations of trans people throughout film history are first, so that you can see the importance of allegorical representation in filling those gaps. Let's define it. Let's define trans allegory, finally. I chose to focus on allegorical rather than literal representations of so-called transgenderism, because it's a less covered topic. Moreover, I think it is a beautiful and understudied methodology of trans storytelling, which has been so essential because our community has had to be so underground. People haven't felt the ability to speak openly about transness, even if the Hays Code or whatever didn't exist. Just think about how rare it is to find gay films. It's the same thing, but low-key worse. Trans allegorical storytelling has given trans people, especially closeted ones, the means to express their story. #mystory. Or at least to see their story reflected in other things, even if that's not necessarily intentional by the creators. Okay, so the million Orbeez question. What is considered a trans allegory in film? For my nefarious purposes, a trans allegory must contain at least some of the following elements. Some kind of bodily transformation, discordant feelings among the body, identity, and society at large, and narratives of marginalization becoming self-realization. Let's get into some examples. Because I'm citing films with those aforementioned themes of transformation and navigating one's identity, there is substantial overlap with things that are also read as an allegory for same-sex desire. You know, shit is subjective. Both can be true. This makes sense, as sex, gender, and sexuality are all complex, intertwined subjects, and sexual minorities have overlapping community and axes of oppression with transgender people. So here is my list of greatest hits for trans allegory in order of release date. Frankenstein, 1931, directed by James Whale. Okay, don't murder me, please, but I have read the book and watched Young Frankenstein plenty of times, but I still haven't watched the OG Frankenstein film. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and its film adaptations have long resonated with trans people, though. I do know that. Especially transsexuals, i.e. those who undergo medical transition. The creation of a human body and personage through medical science is the obvious parallel, as well as the utter loneliness experienced by Frankenstein's creature as a result of his macabre and tragic existence. Also, being created as a fully formed adult can resonate, as many trans people feel a disconnect from who they were during childhood and now. Famous trans historian Susan Stryker writes about her kinship with the creature in her piece My Words to Frankenstein. The transsexual body is an unnatural body. It is the product of medical science. It is a technological construction. It is flesh torn apart and sewn together again in a shape other than that which it was born. In these circumstances, I find a deep affinity between myself, as a transsexual woman, and the monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Like the monster, I'm too often perceived as less than fully human, due to the means of my embodiment. Like the monsters as well, my exclusion from human community fuels a deep and abiding rage in me that I, like the monster, direct against the conditions in which I must struggle to exist. Now we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, also released in 1931, directed by Ruben Mamoulian. I haven't seen this one either, but Again, we have an eccentric, isolated figure who uses medical science to transform himself. While Jekyll and Hyde has often been interpreted as a homosexual allegory, especially due to historical evidence about the author, apparently, to me, that medical transformation theme can also have a strong trans reading. Hyde is a side of him that lives within him despite his attempts to repress it, and comes out in an embodied form to wreak havoc on his life. Kind of like a closeted trans person experimenting with cross-dressing, sometimes even developing an alternate persona to do so. The biological differences between Jekyll and Hyde were conceived at a time when anxieties about a kind of Darwinian degeneration of man were high, and homosexuality was linked with the physical traits of degeneration, like a slighter and more effeminate frame. This strikes me as evocative not just of sexuality, but especially as a performance of gender and the gendered body. It speaks of the anxieties that some part of oneself might be less hardy and masculine and more inclined to a physical femininity. To quote Samuel McIntyre, quote, Jekyll himself describes Hyde as a regression or degeneration of himself, identifying Hyde as, quote, less developed, and thus, quote, smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. In consequence, a hermeneutics of the male body emerges through which external deformities or behaviors could be interpreted as evidence of internal failings. Perhaps internal failings like gender confusion? Dracula's Daughter, 1936, directed by Lambert Hillier. This movie is beautifully shot, and I really tried to pay attention to the whole thing, but there are a lot of parts where frankly uninteresting men take up the screen, and I was just like, can I see Gloria Holden being a brooding lesbian vampire again, please? Anyways, Dracula's daughter, Countess Maria Zaleska, is kind of a self-hating vampire. She tries to break her curse by ritually burning the corpse of her father, the famous Count Dracula. When that doesn't work, she then goes to a psychologist for medical treatment. Conversion therapy vibes, kind of. To unvamp her. She spends a lot of the movie struggling against her dark vampiric urges, but eventually caves and accepts them. It definitely has major lesbian overtones, despite attempts to tone it down, but you can also add the struggling to change her biology layer to it to view more of a trans spin. To quote Ariel Schudson, Countess Zaleska's battle with her queer identity consumes her. From gender turmoil, she wants to be free to live as a woman, to her express need for a standard existence, to live a normal life, think normal things, she feels enslaved by her condition. Not only does she view herself as something other than woman, she views herself as something other than normal. As Zaleska wrestles with her demons and lust gets reiterated in the film text, the film shows itself to be a barely concealed allegory for individuals wrestling with gender identity and/or sexualities. Pinocchio, 1940, directed by Sharpstein and Lusky. Look, I mean, he wants to be a real boy, he becomes a real boy. Seriously, a lot of transmasculine guys connect to this fuck-ass puppet boy. I definitely liked Pinocchio, but probably not much more than other Disney films, I think. They connect to this story in which an initially genderless little guy navigates the world to find his own truth and become a real flesh and blood boy. I found two particularly cool pieces of art that are inspired by the deep childhood connections trans men can have to this character. There's, I guess, like a semi-digital play thing that both toured and streamed in 2022, which is a satirical look at the character of Pinocchio through a transmasc lens. This is The Making of Pinocchio by Cade and Macaskill. The couple who created it did so inspired by Macaskill's own gender transition, and there's some really fun stuff in there, including lots of humor about wood and some freaky puppet sex. There's also a collection of short creative writing works by Lucas Olvera for his master's thesis called The Pinocchio Boy that I found. We've got The Wolfman, 1941, directed by George Wagner. When I watched The Wolfman, I was struck by the emotionally sensitive and very average-looking portrayal of said Wolfman, who was, to my surprise, the protagonist, by leading man Lon Chaney Jr. To me, the tragic figure of the Wolfman is very trans-masc-coded, as werewolves are kind of in general. And this is the first real popular feature film about werewolves, I think. The trans themes are there, especially regarding main character Larry's transformation into the monstrous and very hairy body of the Wolfman. It deals with fighting against one's nature and discusses a complex relationship of the son to the father and the fate of following in your father's footsteps. To quote Henry Giardina, "It's so much a movie about masculinity, our fears around it, which of course are in dialogue with father-son anxiety. It's a movie about the fear of not being able to become your father, as well as a fear around becoming only the worst parts of him." Also interesting, the public and his family, especially Larry's dad, fucking gaslights him about werewolves not being real the entire time this transformation is occurring.
Do you believe in werewolves? I believe that a man lost in the mazes of his mind may imagine that he's anything.
Sounds kind of familiar. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde now, 1971, directed by Roy Ward Baker. I also watched this one, and it's super fun. It's a schlocky twist on Jekyll and Hyde, wherein Dr. Jekyll, obsessed with eternal life, experiments with estrogen, because women tend to live longer, and ends up creating Sister Hyde, this alternate female persona. They keep it all quite biological and don't substantially explore gender as a construct, but it's trans, by virtue of the fact that, in and of itself, a man takes estrogen and becomes a woman. Basically, Sister Hyde slowly takes over while going on murderous sprees as a hot lady and becomes dominant over Jekyll. A quote from Lexi Bowen, or Bowen? "Like so many before and since, they are a character that falls into that ever-changing, ever-confusing ball of movie trans, which encompasses any and every character that, at some point or another, differs from their gender as assigned at birth." The Little Mermaid, 1989, directed by Clements and Musker. It was produced by, and the lyrics written by, a closeted gay man in the 80s, Howard Ashman. The movie obviously deals with forbidden love, which makes sense in that context, but also a biological transformation, which is both a curse and a blessing. The aesthetic of Ursula, as you may know, is also inspired by famous drag queen Therein, also John Waters' muse, I guess? Ariel's misfit archetype is definitely relatable to queer folks, and the neurodiverse, as she feels a longing to be part of the human community, to the extent that she makes ill-advised sacrifices to do so, which puts herself in danger. Quoting a trio polite here, "But the allegory extends beyond forbidden romance for some viewers. Part of Ariel yearning to be part of the surface world comes with a desire to be human. She literally wants to lose her fins and instead have feet. This wish to be in a different body naturally resonates with the transgender community." There's also Ghost in the Shell, 1995, directed by Mamoru Oishi. Ghost in the Shell is an anime film from the turn of the century, which, like its influence Blade Runner, is seminal to cyberpunk imagery. In an iconic sequence, cyborg protagonist Major Motoko Kusunaki's body, which is a fixation of the movie throughout, is literally assembled before our eyes. She dons layers of flesh as the animation focuses on her nude female form, though she is more androgynous and kind of less sexualized than some similar characters both in and out of this film. The film really interrogates the definition of the self. Do our memories define us? What if those memories are false? Do our current actions alone define us? Our body? Our mind? Is there a soul? Is Motoko little more than a violent agent of the state, or is there a person in there? To quote Solvi Gord, "Those questions, am I really real, have I ever existed, or am I a ghost of an identity, are ones many trans people will recognize. The visceral confusion that comes about from knowing how you feel and experience your body, but having that experience jar so powerfully with what meaning other people and society give to it." In general, robots are often an allegory for trans people, or at least trans people tend to identify with the figure of the robot. There's the build-a-body thing. the mind-body disconnect / separation of the self theme, plus alienation from society, feeling like you're artificial or fraudulent somehow. If you want to see a great video about robots in general being allegorical to the trans experience, which analyzes a lot of media about robots, including but not limited to Ghost in the Shell, you should probably watch this video by Ko2 Goldie, Robots as Trans Allegory. The Matrix, 1999, directed by the Wachowski sisters. The Matrix is the only film on this list with trans directors, though neither of them had come out at the time of its release. This one is pretty much an admitted trans allegory, according to Lily Wachowski at least. It's about making the difficult choice to abandon familiarity and falsity for radical self-actualization and truth.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Sounds like a trans person who hasn't fully come to terms with their transness to me. Neo, which by the way is a chosen name different from the character's initial more masculine and respectable moniker of Mr. Thomas Anderson, is living a double life.
Mr. Anderson, it seems that you've been living 2 lives.
But eventually chooses the more authentic and yet harder one, though he knows he'll be persecuted for it. To quote Laura Dale, "Of particular note, while the homogeneous face of civil obedience and status quo Agent Smith insists on discrediting this new chosen identity, those outside of the Matrix all unquestioningly support Neo's name from the very first moments of the film, presenting the idea that escaping those societal expectations is a path to having who you are seen and validated by others." So, the X-Men movies, particularly The Last Stand, directed by Brett Ratner, are also pretty trans. Okay, you all know the basic premise of X-Men, right? Some people are mutants and lots of people hate them. The X-Men comics were initially created as a commentary on the American Civil Rights Movement, I believe. These stories have rightly been seen as an allegory for many things, from racism to homophobia, but they can also have a more specific trans or intersex reading as part of the queer one, especially due to a focus on physical bodily changing and mutilation. Like that scene where Angel, as a kid, is so ashamed by his mutation that he tries to cut off his wings.
Warren? Son, is everything all right? What's going on in there?
Nothing, I'll be right out.
Warren.
1 second!
Mystique is also a canonically gender-fluid character. In the comics, Mystique apparently says, quote, "I have lived for years as sapiens males, years more as females. The only true binary division lies not between the genders or sexes or sexualities. It lies between those who are allowed to be who they wish and those denied that right." We are coming up on the 21st century now, with Gingersnaps, released in 2000, directed by John Fawcett. This is a really cool werewolf movie with some fantastic practical effects. Often interpreted in a feminist and sometimes also queer/lesbian way.
We're almost not even related anymore.
It is also possible for a trans, whether that be transmasc or transfemme, reading of Gingersnaps. It focuses on the teen's rejection of womanhood and feelings of horror at female puberty.
No, I've got weird hairs. So what? That means I've got hormones, and they may make me butt ugly, but they do not make me a monster.
This is driven home by the coincidence, or I guess not really coincidence, of Ginger's werewolf transformation aligning with her first menstrual cycle.
We gotta see the nurse.
I'm sure it seems like a lot of blood. It's a period.
But really, it was like a
geyser. Mm-hmm. Everyone seems to panic their first time.
Seems very transmasc to me. See, it's Forrest There's video if you want more about a transmasc reading of Gingersnaps. The scene of her taping her tail down and shaving all her hair could also be relatable to trans girls too. In general, the film deals with sexuality, gender roles, and coming of age a lot, in a visceral, bloody way. To quote Marissa Mercurio, at once emphasizing the horror of womanhood, Gingersnaps explores the fluidity of gender through Ginger's lycanthropy and her status as outcast alongside Bridget. At the start of the film, it is clear that Ginger and Bridget's androgyny and disinterest in boys characterize their ostracization. Throughout the film, Bridget remains an androgynous prepubescent teen, but there is an inevitability to her fear of becoming gendered. She will get her period sooner rather than later. She will change into a woman in the eyes of society. She will be forced to deal with sexuality and gender under her peers' gaze. Gingersnaps, however, offers another possibility: lycanthropy, a queering. We've also got the Barbie movie from 2023, directed by Greta Gerwig. Barbie is one of the very few films on this list to be directed by a woman. Kind of like Pinocchio, Barbie is on a journey to become a real woman, whether she wants to embrace that initially or not. While her experiences apply to womanhood in general, of course, a case can also be made for trans womanhood more specifically, because it's a lot about self-assemblage and learning as an adult. While Barbie's existence, kind of like someone beginning to explore their gender identity, is at first defined by the more shallow talismans of femininity, like perfect outfits and pink hairbrushes, she soon experiences an existential crisis.
Do you guys ever think about dying?
And is motivated to go out into the real world to restore things to their perfect state. But, spoiler alert, she comes to prefer her more nuanced life as a real woman outside of Barbie land. Joanna Mills says, "Every transgender woman has a similar moment where she realizes living within her own Barbie land no longer fulfills the emotional needs of a real woman. They also begin to see it is impossible to maintain the facade of her perfected avatar." And while you might see the final stinger scene of Barbie at the gynecologist as kind of defining womanhood by the experience of having a vagina, you could also see it as similar to a trans woman finally getting the gender confirmation surgery she's been longing for. We've also got Nimona, again released in 2023, directed by Quain and Bruno. I have not seen Nimona, but I hear good things. The movie is about a shapeshifter who is rejected by society, which turns her into an anti-hero / temporary antagonist, honestly, though in the end, she's redeemed. This is an animated film, but it is very adult. It harshly deals with Nimona's rejection from society and abandonment by her only friend, Ballister, and her subsequent wish to commit suicide. Pretty heavy. In the end, before she can do so, Ballister apologizes, and they reconcile. The author of the comic it is based on is actually trans, which definitely makes the trans / non-binary interpretation hold water a bit more to me. And if you're interested in the trans allegory and Nimona a little more, you can certainly watch this video as well. Lastly, we've got Lisa Frankenstein, 2024, directed by Zelda Williams. Lisa Frankenstein is a horror comedy which, written and directed by women, is a very female-centered story. However, at the risk of #erasing women, there could also maybe be a bit of a trans mask reading to it. It centers on a grieving and depressed outcast Lisa, who finds herself talking to the grave of a Victorian gentleman. When he's resurrected by lightning strike, she starts a friendship which blossoms into something more with him. And he kills her evil stepmom, and things just kind of spiral from there. The film has themes of constructing a new identity in the wake of grief, and the creature, played by Cole Sprouse, reads as transcoded to me. Whether that be kind of like a part of Lisa herself, metaphorically, or just a separate character. This is more than a build-a-boyfriend film. Creature is, with the help of Lisa, reconstructing his identity in his new afterlife. This is especially present in the dress-up montage where the creature consciously chooses more masculine clothes despite Lisa loving him in a pink feathery thing. And most overt, Creature has feelings of insecurity around not having a penis, to which Lisa assures him, "You don't need one of those to be a man. It's actually, like, the least important part, really. We can do other things." That's kind of cute. But in the end, Worry not, the creature severs the penis of Lisa's stepsister's shitty boyfriend, and Lisa lovingly performs a DIY bottom surgery on him. Writer Diablo Cody, who also wrote Jennifer's Body, by the way, also a fantastic fucking film, does view it as a queer story, and emphasized in an interview the theme of transformation. Alright, so yeah, that's my broad overview of trans allegory in various films. But now, let's dig in a little deeper. Thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next one. I'm going to do some deep dives into 3 different movies. First, it's going to be The Last Unicorn, which is kind of a niche, very beautifully animated film from 1989. Next up, it's going to be a Swedish movie, kind of a magical realist one called Border. And then lastly, you know it, I Saw the TV Glow, the ultimate trans movie from recent days. So stay tuned for those ones, guys. I'm going to be releasing this series as soon as I can. I don't have a great timeline for it, but it'll happen. Did y'all hear that?